There is a specific texture to the silence that surrounds a black man in spaces not designed for him. It is not an empty silence, but a heavy one, dense with unasked questions and the static of history waiting to be acknowledged. Marcus knew this silence well. He had studied it just as rigorously as he studied organic chemistry or political philosophy. In the university library, under the hum of fluorescent lights that bleached everything into a uniform sterile white, he found a temporary truce with the world. Here, amidst the smell of decaying paper and the rhythmic scratching of graphite on wide-ruled notebooks, he was simply a scholar. The architecture of the university, with its Gothic spires and manicured lawns, promised a meritocracy where the mind was the only currency that mattered. If he was brilliant enough, if his diction was precise enough, if his posture was unthreatening enough, the armor of academic excellence would protect him. He wore his GPA like a Kevlar vest. But love, he would soon learn, has a way of finding the chinks in even the most carefully constructed armor. When he met Sarah, it was easy to believe that the world outside the campus gates had ceased to exist. Their relationship was a vacuum, sealed tight by late-night debates about existentialism and the shared warmth of coffee cups held in winter-chilled hands. She saw him, or at least, she saw the version of him that flourished in the light of the ivory tower. Articulate, ambitious, safe. She did not see the calculation that went into his every movement, the constant, low-level computation of risk that ran in the background of his mind like a corrupt operating system. So when she invited him home for Thanksgiving to meet her family, to meet the patriarch who held the deed to their generational narrative, she did not understand that she was asking him to cross a border. For her, it was a drive to the suburbs. For Marcus, it was an expedition into the heart of a history that had not yet finished with him. The drive was a slow stripping away of his defenses. As the city skyline receded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the sprawling, leafless oaks of the countryside, Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest. This was the physiological response to the black tax, the preemptive exhaustion of knowing you will have to pay double just to be allowed in the room. He checked his reflection in the visor mirror 3 times. The tie was straight. The haircut was fresh. The smile was practiced. He was preparing to perform the role of the exceptional black man, a character written to put white anxiety at ease. He rehearsed the small talk, innocuous comments about the architecture, polite praise for the food, humble brags about his pre-law track. He was ready to be perfect, because he knew that for men like him, perfection was the minimum requirement for survival. The house was imposing, a colonial revival structure that seemed to frown at the driveway. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and old dust. The family was welcoming, in that frantic, overcompensating way that liberal politeness often manifests. There were too many smiles, too much nodding, a desperate attempt to prove that they did not see color, which only proved that color was the only thing they saw. Marcus played his part flawlessly. He shook hands with the firm grip he had been taught to use. He laughed at the right decibel level. He navigated the minefield of appetizers without spilling a crumb. But the tension in the room gathered like a storm front. They were waiting for the grandfather. He was spoken of in hushed tones, a man of the old world, a man who had built the family fortune in an era where the rules were different. When he finally entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He was wheeled in, a blanket over his knees, his face a roadmap of deep fissures and sunspots. He did not look frail, he looked concentrated. His eyes, milky with age but sharp with intent, swept the room and landed on Marcus with the weight of a gavel. The chatter died. The clinking of silverware stopped. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand, a silent plea for everything to be okay, but Marcus knew that this moment was beyond her control. The old man did not smile. He did not offer the polite, performative welcome that the rest of the family had hidden behind. He wheeled himself closer, ignoring his daughter's nervous introduction, ignoring the social script that everyone else was desperately following. He stopped inches from where Marcus sat. The silence stretched so thin it began to sing in Marcus's ears. He prepared himself for the slur, for the rejection, for the cold shoulder, the standard arsenal of the old guard. He stiffened his spine, ready to deflect the blow with dignity. But the blow never came. Instead, The grandfather reached out a trembling hand, his skin like parchment paper, and gripped Marcus's forearm with shocking strength. He didn't look at Marcus with hate, he looked at him with a terrifying, devastating recognition. He leaned forward, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to scrape against the very walls of the room, and said the words that shattered the polite fiction they were all living in. He didn't ask what Marcus studied. He didn't ask where he was from. He looked into Marcus's eyes, past the student, past the suit, past the carefully curated persona, and whispered a single question that caused Sarah's mother to drop her wine glass, the crystal shattering against the hardwood floor. The reaction wasn't anger. It was a haunting. It was the sound of a ghost recognizing the living. The sound of the glass breaking was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had been written centuries ago. It was not merely the loss of a vessel or the spilling of expensive red liquid that stained the Persian rug like a fresh wound. It was the sudden, violent intrusion of reality into the theater of politeness. For a moment, time suspended itself in the amber light of the dining room chandelier. Marcus did not flinch. He had trained his body for this specific kind of stillness, the stillness of a prey animal that knows movement attracts the predator, or perhaps the stillness of a soldier realizing the truce was a lie. He felt the grandfather's grip loosen, not from kindness, but from the shock of his own utterance. The old man slumped back into the wingback chair, his chest heaving, his eyes still locked on Marcus, watery and wide, seeing something that wasn't quite there, or perhaps seeing something too clearly. Sarah scrambled to clean the mess, her apologies fluttering like panicked birds, desperate to patch the tear in the social fabric. But the tear was too wide. The silence that followed was heavy, humid, and thick with the dust of unaddressed history. In that silence, Marcus felt the familiar phantom weight descend upon his shoulders, the invisible backpack of the black tax. It was a sensation he knew intimately from the hallowed halls of his university. It was the friction of existence. Friction, in physics, is the resistance that one surface or object encounters when moving over another. In sociology, in the lived experience of a black man seeking excellence in spaces built by those who never intended for him to enter, friction is the heat generated by simply existing. He looked at the grandfather and saw the same architecture he saw in the dean's office, in the stone gargoyles of the library, in the portraits of the founding fathers that lined the lecture halls. It was the architecture of exclusion disguised as tradition. The grandfather's question, which still echoed in the room, though no one dared repeat it, was not just an interrogation of Marcus's character, it was an interrogation of his right to be present. This is the double consciousness W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of, manifesting in real time. Marcus had to be two people simultaneously, the loving boyfriend concerned about the broken glass, and the historical subject analyzing the threat level of the environment. He had to calculate his next breath. If he showed anger, he became the caricature they feared. If he showed submissiveness, he betrayed the ancestors who bled for his right to stand tall. The room smelled of roasted lamb and old paper, a scent that suddenly felt suffocating. Marcus adjusted his cufflink, a small, mechanical motion to ground himself. He thought of the library at midnight, the blue light of his laptop, the sheer exhaustion of trying to prove he was merely a student, not a quota, not a diversity hire, not an anomaly. The grandfather's reaction was the physical embodiment of the imposter syndrome Marcus fought every day. It was as if the old man had reached into Marcus's own insecurities and dragged them into the light. The shock that the title of this moment suggests wasn't just the surprise of prejudice, it was the shock of exposure. The grandfather had stripped away the academic accolades, the refined diction, the tailored suit, and reacted to the biological reality of Marcus's skin. It was a rejection of the defense of excellence. We tell ourselves that if we are just smart enough, polite enough, dressed well enough, we can bypass the friction. We can glide over the rough surfaces of history. But friction is inevitable when the surface was designed to slow you down. Marcus looked at Sarah, who was on her knees picking up shards of glass. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with a naive confusion. She didn't understand the language being spoken in the silence. She thought this was an awkward family moment, a faux pas of senility. She didn't see the ghosts. She didn't feel the history of the room compressing the air. This is the tragedy of such love, the unequal distribution of burden. She could walk away from this dinner thinking her grandfather was just old-fashioned. Marcus had to walk away carrying the knowledge that his very presence was a disruption to the natural order of this house. The grandfather wasn't just reacting to a boyfriend, he was reacting to a paradigm shift he couldn't process. The friction was the heat of a world changing against the will of those who owned it. As Marcus looked back at the old man, he realized the trembling hand wasn't just age. It was fear. The grandfather was afraid. And that realization shifted the power dynamics in the room instantly. The tension wasn't just about whether Marcus belonged there. It was about the fact that he was there, immovable, brilliant, and undeniable, and the old world was shattering like the glass on the floor, unable to hold the wine of the new era. The haunting wasn't a ghost from the past, it was the terrifying arrival of the future. To understand the silence that followed the shattering of the wineglass in that dining room, one must first understand the architecture of the silence that Marcus lived in for years prior. It was a silence forged not in the absence of sound, but in the suppression of self. Long before he ever stepped foot onto the manicured lawn of Emily's ancestral home, Marcus had been constructing a suit of armor made entirely of accolades. This is the hidden chapter of the story, the one that usually gets glossed over in favor of the romance or the conflict. It is the story of the library at 3 a.m., where the only sound is the humming of the HVAC system and the scratching of a pen against paper, a sound that felt less like writing and more like digging. For Marcus, the university campus was not merely a playground for intellectual curiosity, it was a proving ground where the margin for error was mathematically zero. This is the weight of the straight A. In the cultural lexicon, we often speak of academic excellence as a ticket out, a way to ascend the socioeconomic ladder. But for a black man entering spaces historically designed to exclude him, excellence is not a ladder, it is a shield. Marcus learned early on that to be average was to be invisible, or worse, to be a statistic. To be excellent, however, was to be undeniable. He cultivated a persona of unassailable competence. Every essay was proofread 4 times, not out of a desire for perfection, but out of a fear of giving them ammunition. The double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about a century ago was alive and well in the lecture halls Marcus inhabited. He was constantly watching himself being watched. He knew that when he raised his hand to speak, he wasn't just Marcus, he was a representative of an entire demographic. If he stumbled over his words, it wasn't just a slip of the tongue, it was a confirmation of a bias held by someone in the back row. This creates a psychological load that is invisible to the naked eye but crushing to the spirit. It is the exhaustion of performance. When he met Emily, she was a breath of fresh air precisely because she lived outside of this pressure cooker. She studied art history because she loved beauty. She got B's sometimes and laughed about them. Her failures were just moments in time, not indictments of her character. Marcus fell in love with her because she represented a lightness of being that he had never allowed himself to feel. But this is where the tragedy begins to take shape. Marcus believed that his armor, his 4.0 GPA, his accolades, his articulate speech, his tailored blazer, would protect him when he crossed the threshold into her world. He believed that if he presented himself as the perfect specimen of the modern scholar, the grandfather would have no choice but to respect him. He thought the rules of the university applied to the rules of the living room. This was the fundamental miscalculation. The weight of the straight A is heavy, but it is valid currency only in specific markets. When he walked into that house, he wasn't met with an appraisal of his transcript. He was met with an appraisal of his existence. The grandfather didn't care about the physics exam Marcus had aced. In fact, the excellence made it worse. If Marcus had been a caricature, a stereotype that the grandfather could look down upon with pity or disdain, the tension might have been manageable. It would have fit into a worldview where the old man was superior. But Marcus was not a caricature. He was brilliant. He spoke with the precision of a surgeon. He held his posture with the dignity of a king. And this is what truly shocked the room. The grandfather's reaction wasn't just racism, it was the terror of obsolescence. He looked at Marcus and saw a man who had survived the fire, a man who had worked twice as hard to get half as far and had still arrived at the same dinner table. The straight A wasn't just a grade, it was a weapon that dismantled the grandfather's sense of natural order. The heavy silence in the library had prepared Marcus for the heavy silence of the dinner table, but it hadn't prepared him for the realization that his excellence would not save him from hatred. In fact, his excellence was exactly what provoked it. The friction in the air was the sound of a meritocratic lie unraveling. Marcus realized, in the slow-motion aftermath of the broken glass, that he had spent his entire life building a resume to impress people who would never read it. He had perfected the art of being acceptable to a world that was determined to reject him regardless of the data. The tragedy of the straight A is that it promises safety in exchange for perfection, but it cannot deliver safety in the face of history. As he sat there, the smell of red wine rising from the carpet like a sacrificial offering, Marcus felt the weight of every late night, every skipped party, every moment of self-censorship crashing down on him. He had done everything right. He had followed the script of the model minority to the letter. And yet, the glass still shattered. The look in the grandfather's eyes revealed the dark truth. You can work hard enough to earn the degree, but you cannot work hard enough to earn your humanity in the eyes of those who refuse to see it. The armor was heavy, and for the first time, Marcus wondered if it was worth wearing. To understand the silence that followed the shattering of the glass, one must first understand the architecture of the mask. It is a survival mechanism that predates the individual, a spiritual inheritance passed down from father to son in hushed tones before leaving the safety of the house. We often describe code switching as a linguistic tool, a simple modulation of slang into the King's English to facilitate professional movement. But to view it only as language is to miss the immense psychological toll of the act. For Marcus, sitting across from a man whose eyes held the weight of a century of exclusionary history, code switching was not merely changing how he spoke, it was a violent recalibration of his entire existence. It was the frantic, invisible labor of shrinking one's soul to fit into a space that was never designed to hold it. The air in the dining room was thick, smelling of roasted meat and old varnish, a scent that felt synonymous with a specific kind of generational permanence. Marcus felt the instinct kick in, the same instinct that had guided him through AP classes where he was the only black face, and through university seminars where he was expected to speak on behalf of an entire demographic. He felt his spine stiffen, not with the rigidity of fear, but with the practiced posture of non-threatening excellence. He adjusted the timbre of his voice, smoothing out the edges, raising the pitch slightly to disarm the listener. It is a strange and tragic thing to have to curate one's own humanity in real time, to edit the raw footage of your personality before it even reaches the screen of the other person's perception. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting near his on the tablecloth. To her, this was just dinner with Grandpa. To her, the tension in the room was a social awkwardness, a hurdle to be cleared with polite conversation. She did not see the war taking place behind Marcus's eyes. He began to speak, attempting to sweep the shards of the broken moment under the rug of his credentials. He talked about his thesis on macroeconomic theory. He mentioned his internship at the firm downtown, carefully dropping the names of partners who might be recognized in this zip code. This is the defense of excellence. The belief that if you can just stack enough achievements on the scale, they will eventually outweigh the color of your skin. Marcus was building a fortress of accolades, brick by brick, hoping it would be high enough to hide behind. But every word felt heavy, like stones in his mouth. He could feel the dissociation setting in, that ghostly sensation where you watch yourself perform from a distance. He saw himself nodding politely, saw himself smiling at the right intervals, saw himself cutting his food with surgical precision so as not to make a sound against the china. The mask was perfect. It was impenetrable. It was the accumulation of 20 years of being one of the good ones. And yet, across the table, the grandfather did not seem impressed by the resume. He did not nod at the mention of the dean's list. He sat in a stillness that felt predatory, his gaze fixed not on the mask, but on the fear that necessitated it. This is the paradox of the code switch in the face of deep-seated bias. The more perfect the performance, the more it highlights the fact that a performance is required. By trying so hard to prove he belonged, Marcus was inadvertently signaling that he knew he didn't. The grandfather took a slow sip of wine, the liquid dark and opaque in the crystal glass. The silence stretched, turning the hum of the refrigerator in the other room into a roar. Sarah tried to interject, to fill the void with a story about how they met in the library, attempting to humanize a situation that had become entirely symbolic. But her voice sounded thin, fragile against the density of the history in the room. Then, the grandfather finally spoke, and his reaction was not the explosion of anger Marcus had braced for, nor was it the polite dismissal he was used to. It was something far more disorienting. He placed his fork down, the metal clicking against the plate with the finality of a gavel, and looked directly at Marcus. Not through him, but into him. "You are exhausted, aren't you?" the old man asked. The question hung in the air, shocking in its intimacy. It wasn't a query about his studies or his drive. It was an observation of the performance itself. It stripped away the accolades and the carefully modulated voice, exposing the sweaty, terrified effort beneath. The shock wasn't that the grandfather was racist. The shock was that he saw the mask clearly, recognized the labor involved in wearing it, and refused to let Marcus hide behind the safety of his perfection. In that moment, the code switch failed, not because Marcus slipped up, but because the audience refused to participate in the play. The armor fell away, leaving him naked in the chair, forcing a confrontation not with his credentials, but with his reality. The silence of a lecture hall is rarely ever truly silent. If you listen closely, beneath the scratching of graphite against paper and the rhythmic tapping of laptop keys, there is a low-frequency hum. It is the sound of electricity coursing through fluorescent tubes, the ventilation systems recycling stale air, and for Marcus, the deafening roar of his own hyper-awareness. He sat in the third row, the optimal position for engagement, close enough to be seen, far enough to survey the room, returning to the academic arena with the grandfather's words still ringing in his ears. "You are exhausted, aren't you?" The question had followed him from the living room, through the drive back to campus, and into this seminar on 20th century political theory. Before that meeting, Marcus had viewed the classroom as a battlefield where he was winning. He had armed himself with vocabulary, armored himself in tweed and denim, and wielded his intellect like a sword to cut through the thicket of lowered expectations. But now, the armor felt heavy. The ghost in the classroom was not a specter of the dead, but the phantom of the living man he was not allowed to be. He looked around the room, a sea of faces that reflected the demographic majority, and realized that for his peers, this was simply school. For them, a wrong answer was a momentary lapse in memory, a forgivable error. For Marcus, a wrong answer was a confirmation of a stereotype, a betrayal of his race, a crack in the dam that held back a flood of historic scrutiny. The grandfather had shocked everyone not by rejecting Marcus, but by validating the invisible labor Marcus performed every single day. Now, sitting under the harsh, institutional lighting, that labor felt unbearable. The professor, a man with patches on his elbows and a gentle, wandering gaze, posed a question about the social contract. Marcus felt the familiar impulse rise within him, the reflex to perform excellence. His hand twitched. He knew the answer. He could cite Rousseau and Locke. He could draw parallels to contemporary socioeconomics that would make the professor nod in that vigorous, approving way that made Marcus feel safe. But for the first time, he hesitated. The ghost whispered to him. It asked him why he needed to speak. It asked him why his silence felt like a failure. This is the counterstory of the black academic experience. The assumption that presence is enough, when in reality, presence is a constant negotiation. Marcus watched a student in the front row, a young man with disheveled hair and a relaxed posture, offer a half-baked opinion based on a gut feeling. The student wasn't anxious. He wasn't calculating the socio-political ramifications of his sentence structure. He just spoke. And in that casual, reckless freedom, Marcus saw exactly what he had lost. The ghost in the classroom was the double consciousness W.E.B. Du Bois had written about a century ago, now mutated into a high-definition anxiety. It was the sensation of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Except here, in the ivory tower, the contempt was masked as curiosity, and the pity was masked as inclusion. Marcus looked over at his girlfriend, who sat 2 rows over. She was taking notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. She loved him, he knew that. But could she see the ghost? Could she feel the temperature drop when he walked into a seminar, the subtle shift in body language, the way the air grew thin? The grandfather had seen it. That old man, with his history etched into the lines of his face, had looked past the collegiate facade and seen the exhausted human being beneath. It changed the texture of the room. The lecture continued, words floating in the air like dust motes: liberty, property, rights. Abstract concepts that meant very different things depending on who was listening. Marcus let his hand fall back to the desk. He didn't answer the question. He let the silence stretch, let the ghost sit beside him, acknowledging for the first time that his excellence was a trauma response, a frantic attempt to outrun a history that was already sitting in the chair before he arrived. The hum of the lights seemed to grow louder, a drone of expectation. He realized then that the shock of the grandfather's reaction wasn't just about insight, it was a permission slip. It was a terrifying permission to stop running, even if just for a moment, right here in the middle of the class. But stopping is dangerous when you are running on a treadmill. You don't just stand still, you get thrown backward. And as the professor's eyes scanned the room and landed briefly on Marcus, waiting for the star pupil to perform his trick, Marcus stared back, silent, letting the weight of the moment exist without his intervention, letting the ghost be seen. We often speak of love as if it were a clean slate, a fresh territory where 2 people can meet without the baggage of the centuries that forged them. We like to believe that affection is a universal solvent, capable of dissolving the rigid structures of history, class, and race. But this is the romance of the naive. In reality, when we enter a room, we do not enter alone. We drag a legion of ancestors behind us, their triumphs, their traumas, and their unresolved questions clinging to the hem of our coats like burrs from a long walk through high grass. Marcus understood this, though perhaps only intuitively at first. As they drove away from the insulated safety of the university campus and toward the sprawling, manicured estate of her family, the air in the car changed. The oxygen seemed to thin. The playful debates about philosophy and art that had defined their courtship in the library were replaced by a dense, suffocating silence. He was no longer just a student, a boyfriend, or an individual. He was becoming a representative. This is the ancestral blueprint, the pre-written architectural plan that dictates how a black man must construct himself in spaces that were not built with him in mind. As the car crunched over the gravel driveway, Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the psychological armor clicking into place. He checked his reflection in the visor mirror, not out of vanity, but out of a need for tactical assurance. Was the tie straight? Was the haircut non-threatening? Was the smile calibrated to the exact degree of warmth that signals safety without suggesting intimacy? He was preparing to perform the oldest trick in the book, the act of making others comfortable with his existence. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and old money. It was a scent that Marcus associated with the administrative buildings where he fought for financial aid, a scent that whispered of exclusion. The introductions were a blur of polite nods and firm handshakes, the kind of social choreography that everyone knows the steps to but no one enjoys. Then, he saw the grandfather. The man sat in a high-backed leather chair by the window, a figure carved from a different era. He did not rise. His hands, spotted with age and wrapped around a cane, looked like dormant roots. When Marcus approached, the room seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment the title of the story promised, the pivot point where the narrative teeters. Marcus extended his hand, his voice pitched to a perfect, non-threatening baritone, reciting the lines of the respectful suitor. He expected resistance. He expected the cold shoulder of old prejudice, or perhaps the overly loud performative kindness of liberal guilt. He was ready for bigotry, he had studied for it like a final exam. He was ready for condescension, he had a degree in navigating it. But he was not ready to be seen. The grandfather did not take the offered hand immediately. Instead, his pale, watery eyes locked onto Marcus's face, bypassing the smile, bypassing the polite greeting, and drilling straight into the fatigue that lay beneath. It was a gaze that felt invasive, archaeological. The silence stretched out, becoming a physical weight in the room. Her parents shifted uncomfortably, ready to intervene, ready to smooth over the rough edges of their patriarch. But then the old man spoke, his voice raspy but clear, cutting through the hum of the room like a serrated blade. He didn't ask about Marcus's major. He didn't ask where he was from. He simply said, "You are exhausted, aren't you, son?" The question hung in the air, shocking in its intimacy. It wasn't a malicious observation, it was a recognition. It was a shattering of the fourth wall. For a second, the mask slipped. Marcus felt a sudden, vertigo-inducing rush of emotion because the grandfather had identified the one thing Marcus had spent his entire academic career trying to hide. The sheer, bone-deep labor of being excellent in a world that expected him to be dangerous. The grandfather continued, ignoring the gasps of his family. "I can see the effort it takes for you to stand there and be so palatable. It must be a terrible weight to carry." This was the shock. Not a slur, but a mirror. The reaction that stunned everyone was not an act of rejection, but a brutally honest dismantling of the charade. The grandfather, a man of a hardened, perhaps darker time, refused to participate in the polite fiction that Marcus was just another guest. He acknowledged the black tax right there at the dinner table. He acknowledged that for Marcus to be standing there, holding that hand, wearing that suit, speaking that way, required a Herculean effort of suppression. In that moment, the ancestral blueprint was laid bare on the white tablecloth. The history of survival, of code switching, of the double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about, was suddenly the centerpiece of the conversation. Marcus stood there, his hand still half extended, realizing that he had been recognized not for his performance, but for the cost of it. The silence that followed in the wake of the grandfather's pronouncement was not the silence of emptiness, but of sudden, overwhelming density. It was as if the air in the dining room had been replaced by water, heavy and crushing, slowing every movement, every breath. Marcus sat there, the echo of the old man's words still vibrating against the fine china and the crystal glasses. The reaction that had shocked everyone was not an explosion of bigotry, as the anxious glances of his girlfriend's parents had anticipated, nor was it the polite, colorblind dismissal that serves as the modern guise of erasure. It was a moment of terrifying, unvarnished visibility. The grandfather, a man etched from the rough stone of a different century, had looked at Marcus and refused to accept the performance. He had refused to accept the perfectly tied tie, the modulated cadence of the voice, the academic credentials laid out like a peace offering. He had looked past the armor of excellence that Marcus had spent 2 decades forging and had spoken directly to the exhaustion underneath it. By acknowledging the cost of Marcus's presence, by stating plainly that he knew what it took for a black man to sit at that table and remain composed, he had shattered the comfortable illusion of the evening. The parents wanted to believe in a world where love is simple and meritocracy is real. The grandfather, in his blunt, shocking candor, forced them to see the machinery of survival that hummed beneath Marcus's skin. Later, as they walked to the car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet sounded like thunder in the quiet neighborhood. The sensory details of the night seemed heightened, sharp enough to cut. The smell of rain on asphalt, the distant hum of the highway, the cold bite of the wind against his face. It all felt more real than the climate-controlled politeness of the house they had just left. His girlfriend, usually so articulate, so sure of her place in the world, was quiet. She was grappling with a sudden shift in her own reality. She had fallen in love with Marcus the student, Marcus the intellectual, Marcus the man who could quote Baldwin and Fanon in seminars. But tonight, she had met Marcus the survivor. She had seen, perhaps for the first time, that his excellence was not just a trait, but a defense strategy. Her grandfather's reaction, that nod of grim recognition, that refusal to let Marcus hide behind his resume, had exposed the invisible labor of the relationship. It is one thing to love someone across the color line. It is another to understand that one partner is swimming against a current the other cannot even feel. This is the final lesson, the resonance that lingers long after the grades are posted and the degrees are framed. The university tells us that the mind is a sovereign entity, that ideas can transcend the body and its history. But the body keeps the score. The black student in the white institution is never just a student. He is a diplomat, a representative, a rebuttal to a stereotype, and a guardian of his own dignity, all while trying to conjugate verbs or solve equations. The grandfather's shock was the catalyst for Marcus to realize that he could no longer sustain the fragmentation of his soul. He realized that the double consciousness Du Bois spoke of was not a permanent sentence, but a challenge to be overcome through integration. He did not need to be two people, the safe, palatable scholar and the hidden, authentic man. He needed to be one. The drive back to campus was a journey between two worlds. As the streetlights rhythmically illuminated the interior of the car, casting fleeting shadows across their faces, Marcus felt a strange lightness. The worst had happened. He had been fully seen, stripped of his pretenses, and the world had not ended. In fact, it had begun. The defense of excellence, the need to be twice as good to get half as far, would always be an external pressure, a societal tax levied by a system built on exclusion. But internally, Marcus decided to stop paying it. He would no longer code switch for survival. He would speak his truth not to persuade, but to exist. The relationship, if it were to survive, would have to exist in this new truth. It could no longer be a refuge from race, but a partnership that walked through the fire of it. The grandfather, in his shocking refusal to play the game, had inadvertently handed Marcus the keys to his own liberation. The lesson was not that love conquers all, but that truth conquers fear. To stand in one's own skin, without apology, without the desperate need to prove one's humanity to those who question it, that is the ultimate academic achievement. That is the graduation that matters. As the campus skyline came into view, a silhouette of spires and dormitories against the dark sky, Marcus exhaled. He was no longer just a visitor in the house of knowledge. He was, finally, at home in himself.